So welcome back, and in this couple videos, I think probably break it into like 3 different videos, maybe 4. We're really talking about access policies, like how are we going to access the fabric. If you think about like normal NXOS, when we configured that access, we would go in there and we'd say, we'd go into a specific interface. We might say, switch port, switch mode access, spanning tree, port type edge trunk, whatever the spanning tree parameter was. If we had to set a speed, we'd set the speed, duplex, the port channeling method if we were going to be a port channel. So there was a lot of things that we as the engineer or administrator did that maybe, we'd done it so many times we weren't even really cognizant that we were doing it anymore. Putting in a port in a specific VLAN, for instance. So we still have to do that within ACI, but now again we're dealing with a policy-driven model. So we have to change the way that we actually push policy out to these individual switches and subsequently the switch ports hanging off of those switches. So a lot of the things, again, VLANs, the interface configs, a lot of that you saw in the interface policies video, we're going to have to find a way where we take this policy that we kind of create within the APIC interface and we push that out to specific leaf switches, right? Because the leafs are where we're going to be connecting all of our hosts. So what we're talking about now is this process, and it's a big process, guys. All of this is going to be done. This is like when I said earlier that really there's two kind of types of ACI config. You're going to do the physical fabric configuration, and then you're going to do the logical tenant configuration. Well, what we're talking about right now is that physical fabric configuration. We have to knock that out first before the tenant will ever have that connectivity there so that they can do whatever they're going to do. So the first real part to this is, for me at least, this is again, guys, there's 100 different ways to do things in IT, right? This is the way that I have rationalized it in my mind. It may not work for you, but at least you'll know the constructs after this, and maybe you can rearrange this puzzle to make more sense to you. But again, this is how I've kind of broken it down. So the first real component that we have to identify is actually what I call the switch profiles. And this is where we identify the individual switches that are going to be participating on our fabric, specifically the leaf switches. I'm not talking about the spine switches at all here. We're talking specifically about our leaf nodes. So if we have 3 leaf nodes, I'm basically going to come in and I'm going to build 3 different switch profiles. I may have switch profile 101, switch profile 102, and then I'll build one for maybe a VPC domain that's going to identify the logical switch, i.e. the VPC domain that those 2 physical switches comprise. So if we take a look, our topology for a lot of our demos is going to look something like this. We're going to have, our single spine switch. He's going to be up here kind of chilling. Remember, he's the Oracle. He knows everything. He's just kind of like, oh. And then we're going to have leaf 1, which is what we're going to refer to, or we refer to as node 101. And then we're going to have leaf 2, which is essentially, I think 102 is what we use there. So these guys are all connected kind of like this. So from a switch profile perspective, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a switch profile that encompasses this guy. I'm going to build, and that'll be our first one, right? I'm going to build a switch profile that's going to encompass this guy. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to build another 3rd switch profile that encompasses both of them together. And again, the reason that I do that is because we may end up doing VPC. Say if we have 2 9300s in the top of a single rack. Well, we may come in and form a VPC domain with those guys so that we can have logical port channels going from those 2 to maybe a single server, maybe another switch, maybe another pair of switches that are also running VPC. So I identified, each individual switch, and then I identified the virtual switches that are going to comprise, or the virtual switch that is comprised of those 2 physical switches. So again, that's typically how I go, and I'll do that right out of the gate. Again, that's right there after interface policies. I usually go in and I'll do these switch profiles. So next, we want to go in and we want to identify the interfaces that we're going to be using. And this can also be tricky, so it's kind of, we'll see it kind of laying out like this, where we have our switch profile, and those switch profiles are going to contain these interface profiles, which have the individual ports within them. All right, and I know that sounds a little bit tricky, and there's a couple things that I do. I've read on other blogs too that a lot of other people do it this way. But I identify, again, a specific switch. So when I create my interface profile, I'll do it for a specific switch. So if we came in here and say I identified switch 1. So I built a switch profile for switch 1. When I come out to do my interface profile, I'm going to build an interface profile specifically for that switch. So I may have, switch 101, we might call it, int profile. Again, I try to be pretty literal when I'm in ACI, because when you come back to reference these policies later, if you have a really good name for it, it's going to make a lot more sense. So what I might do is create an interface profile for switch 101, and then within that interface profile, we put in something called an interface selector. And that's really nothing more than identifying a port or a range of ports. Now, if we go back here, I have some advice that I've kind of strung out here for you guys. Whoa. Oh, not in transparent mode. I have some advice, and my advice to you is identify each port individually. This will be a little bit easier once we get past, understanding basic OSPF, understanding basic ACI, and once you get into the scripting portion, this becomes a little bit easier to do. But I recommend that you go in there and you identify each port individually. Okay, each port individually, because later if you have to remove a port for some reason, actually let me go big on my whiteboard. I see my very large head is blocking some of this. If we go back to the drawing here, what we can do when we do our interface selectors is we can actually go in here and I could build an interface selector. We could just call it selector 1, but I could say I want this to encompass, interface Ethernet 1.1 through 1.5. Well, then this specific selector, which we refer to as selector 1, now has a range of ports, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5. So if later I ever have to come out and pull out 1.5 for some reason and maybe put it in a different interface profile, I have to delete this whole range. Okay, and that can cause some problems if some of these other ports are already in use. So what I try to do is, as I go in and begin configuring these interface profiles and these interface selectors, rather than doing a range of ports, I'll typically come in and maybe I'll do selector 1 again, but selector 1 is only going to point towards interface Ethernet 1.1. And then I build a selector 2, and selector 2 is going to be pointed to interface Ethernet 1.2. That way, if I have to come back later and maybe I need to move, interface Ethernet 1.2 to a different switch interface profile, I can just delete it out of this one, and it's not going to cause any disruption on any other ports. And again, it's just different strokes for different folks, right? But that's the way that I kind of choose to do it. So typically what I'll do is I'll build out, interface profiles for each switch and each switch profile. So again, if we look back at our whiteboard here, just so this makes perfect sense, let me erase some of this stuff. From an interface profile perspective, what I'm typically going to do is this guy, I meant to get red there, he's going to have his own interface profile and his own interface selectors. This switch is also going to have his own interface profile and interface selectors. And then I'm also going to build one for this VPC domain. Okay, so for the switch profile that I built here, that third one for the VPC domain, I'm also going to have another interface profile for it. Right? And it's going to have its own interface selectors. So the reason that I do it like this, and you're going to see as we start to build this out, it is necessary, is, and the reason I say that I use individual interface selectors is, imagine again if we had interface 1 and maybe interface 2 down here, in the interface profile for switch 101. Okay, and then later I decide, oh, you know what, I'm going to take interface 2 and it's going to be a VPC member port. So you end up having to come out here and delete it, and move it up here, okay? See, that didn't cause any problem. Had it been in a range down here, we would have had some issues with that because, again, we would have had to delete the range, re-add the individual ports, and then move port 2 up here to this new interface profile. So again, typically I'll do everything individually, and that's, again, just kind of an ease of use thing. I found through, again, experience that it's just easier to go ahead and identify that stuff kind of from the get-go.